Okay.
When we went back to Noonan for the old acquaintance reunion, we went into town, we were in the motel, and Judy read in the local paper a story about some young people being taken to Washington by their teacher because they had won a contest.
National History Day.
Yeah. And the subject of their essays had been the right to protest in the 20th century. Well, of course,
Or the role of protest.
Yeah, of course, they had written about Rosa Parks.
And Martin Luther King.
Yeah. And even though they were white. And Judy said, I wonder if they know that there's been protests of another kind in this community. And so she called up the high school social studies teacher who was mentioned in the story.
She was the chairman of the department.
And we were absolutely amazed.
Ms. Tidwell.
Tidwell, good. They invited us over
to
look at our material.
We said, yeah, I called her up and I said, I'm so impressed by what your students have done. And, as a matter of fact, we are filmmakers and researchers and we're here in town. And do you know that we have archival footage of a protest that took place in your town in 1934? She said, what could have taken place here in 1934? I said, well, we have old newsreel footage of this big labor protest that took place right here in Noonan. She said, you're kidding. I said, would you like to see it? She said, sure. So it was the last day of school. The teachers had a half day, and then they were going for their annual picnic in the park. And she invited the whole social studies department, like 12 teachers, to come and meet with me and George so we could show them this archival footage of the strike of 34.
Well, and we were, our hearts were in our mouth. It shows that we were more braced than these people. Well,
more what than them?
More braced, more afraid than the local people.
Which is something we should talk about. I mean, ironically, there was always this, I wrote this, I made a note. Why were we afraid? Why were we afraid to talk about the strike?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we would go into town undercover on some level and be nervous that they'd open up the trunk.
Let me tell you why we were afraid. Because violence had always been a part of labor organizing. The people who, Lloyd Gossett had told us about getting run out of town. Eula McGill had told us about running out of town. I had done work with the Myrdal study in which I knew people had gotten. That fear was not unfounded, even though I had done 6 months of research for the Myrdal study about how we kept blacks from voting and never got physically frightened. I had worked for 2 years for the Farm Security Administration there. But I knew that when we talked about labor and strikes, we were talking about things that always ended up in the Southern community to violence.
And always ended up with looked at, conceived of, or talked about with a certain image.
Yeah.
Right? Which led me to wonder, George, I'm this Jewish girl from New York, and you're bringing me down here. I've never been down south before, except for 24 hours.
Could you talk actually a little bit about that, just briefly? So, for example, George, you being from a native of North Carolina, and Judith being a Jewish New Yorker.
I have to admit that when I first invited Judy to come down, I was thinking of her in terms of somebody who knew how to do documentary research, somebody to handle details, somebody who liked me well enough to be a loyal foot soldier. I had no idea that she was going to be the central person to get people to respond.
And why do you think that was?
Very simple. And it took me a long time to actually put words to it. Mm-hmm. But I felt it from fairly early on. Every time I appeared to these textile workers, I looked middle class. I sounded middle class. I reminded them of the shoe salesman who'd been mean to them 50 years before, and they'd never forgotten it. Mm-hmm. I reminded them of the straw boss. I represented a class that they had one way or another either courted or but felt separated from. Judy.
And George, how did you feel about them? The cotton mill workers.
Yeah. I was surprised. I was condescending, I suppose. I hope it wasn't showing in my manner, because I'd done a lot of research in the South, and I knew that one didn't do that. And I like to listen to people, and I like good people.
And you're Southern.
Yeah, I'm a Southerner. But I was constantly surprised by their articulateness and the complexity of their lives. One of the first things we started doing was asking about, did they have family photos? And how did they would come? All of that footage we have, for example, of Etta Mae Zimmerman, showing all of these books of her family. I didn't think that Southern textile workers had that kind of thing. I didn't think they cared that much, I guess. So that my feelings were constantly there. I don't know how much I talked about it to Judy, but on the other hand, Judy, was young and enthusiastic, very different from me, and I realized later that when I asked a question, it was I was the teacher asking the question, and I knew the answer, and they were wondering if they were going to have it right or not. When Judy asked a question, well, honey, let me tell you. And so that particularly with the women, and of course this is primarily a women's story. It's interesting that it is when the final film is primarily a women's story. She got these people to talk in a way that I don't think I could have. I think this really hit home when we were looking for that woman. You can come up with the name. We have a picture of her in the Bettman archive.
The woman holding the baby and the 2 sacks of food.
That's right.
The woman from Belmont, North Carolina.
Yeah, and she has a baby on the arm. And we actually found that her name was on the back of the photograph. Mm-hmm. And so we actually found her. We found her sister, and we did interviews with her sister, but she wouldn't talk with us. And who was helping us?
Well, there was a reporter that was with us at the time.
Yeah, but she wouldn't talk with us for a long time.
Betty Henson.
Betty Henson helped us. And even with Betty's help, and we finally got her to come to a neighbor's house to talk. But afterward, we found...
we went to her house. We couldn't bring the camera in, remember?
Because her husband was a bit queer.
As they said.
Yeah, a bit...
And queer in that context means what?
Funny about strangers.
Okay.
A bit odd and suspicious. And...
we have quotes around all
this. So we had to do the interview in the neighbor's house.
But the first time we walked into her house, we sat with her.
That's
you left her your card, and she was really nervous because you were a professor.
Yeah. And we only learned later, after we'd done the interview, that her sister said that she didn't want to talk to me because she was afraid to talk in front of a professor. She was ashamed to talk in front of a professor. Well, now, how much that happened, we don't know. I suppose that it helped that I was a professor to get some of the employers to speak. I know that if Judy had gone in on her own in some places, it would have been, "Who are you?" So I maybe gave her a bit of a framework
in a way.
Yeah, but there was no question about it. And this was an accident. I mean, it happened. I didn't know it was going to happen.
George, how did you, I mean, and I was nervous.
Mm-hmm.
I brought all the traditional stereotypes with me
Well,
that
look.
New Yorkers have about the South.
Judy, really, all you have to do is to read this book, the Scottsboro, Stories of Scottsboro. The anti-Semitism in this is just shocking, and the haunting story of the big case in Atlanta. What's that? The Frank case. Leo Frank case in Atlanta that set the whole anti-Semitic tone.
That's what my parents knew.
Sure, of course. Did they say anything explicitly to you?
Oh, well, and the other thing that they knew about was Shaney and Goodman. You know, Goodman, Shaney, and Schwerner.
Yeah.
Who, Goodman and Schwerner were both Jewish.
That's right.
So my parents had never been down south, and they were sort of terrified for me. They said, you're Jewish, you're young, you're a woman, and you're going out to make a film about unions. Like, this could be a problem. I think they sort of said, Judy, just be careful, you know how they feel about Jews. I mean, my parents just didn't quite know. But I knew that. I mean, and so...
Also, I think, when I was doing research for the Myrdal study in 1940, and when I was doing work with Farm Security Administration, well, let's stick to the Myrdal thing. Here I was trying to find out how they kept blacks from voting in the rows of the blacksmiths. But I was white, I was college bred, and I had a research motive. This wasn't something that could be translated into action, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I played the Southerner. Look, they want to know how you feel. They want to know how you feel. But I think most important, the violence of the civil rights movement hadn't happened yet. Here we were, Judy and I, going down after the civil rights movement, when violence...
But violence and unions have always been... every organizer we spoke to talked about that.
Right.
So that we had every reason. And also, I knew, and I've known this ever since I made films and wrote stories and stuff and so on, is that when you get people involved in telling a story which is going to be socially questioned, you're endangering them. And that's always been a bother to me. That's one of the reasons why maybe I wasn't as good a reporter as I should have been in some instances.
You felt, for example, hesitant in asking certain questions that might compromise them in their community.
Sure, that's right. And I'm enough of a Southerner not to want to make people feel ill at ease.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, sometimes that could be what makes good filmmaking. A little bit.
Of course.
Right?
But over and over again, you could hear it on the tape, we were creeping up and creeping up and creeping up.
Like vultures.
Yeah. Well...
I'm joking.
No, vultures attack.
But George, the ironic thing is that I was as I've told George, the day before we went down south for the first time, I went to this clothing store and I said, I'm going down south. I'm making this film. I'm working on this film about unions. I'm Jewish. I'm from New York.
What do I wear?
What do I wear? All I have is black clothing. What am I going to do? And they looked at me and they said, gingham, Judith, gingham. And so they all had these wacky stereotypes too. So before I know it, they're giving me all these plaids and ginghams and color. And then they look at me and they go, and you have to shave your pits. I said, come on. They said, either that or, and as you see, I've overcome that. And so I did all of those things because I was so scared.
And Judy's first display of her ignorance about things in the South happened
within 24 hours of my being there.
We were in a shopping mall, and we wanted to have breakfast. And we went into a steam table, and they had grits. And Judy said, "What are grits? What are they?" She said, "What's that?" And they said, "Grits." She said, "What's that?" Well, they cracked up.
And then I said, "I guess I'll get a bowl and a spoon," because I thought it was like porridge or something. They cracked up.
Anyway, that was the first.
But were our fears founded? I mean, do you think that our fears about how people would stereotype us or me, and did you have those fears? Did you ever think, remember once I turned to you and I said, "George, I think you set me up." and I can't remember if you said, "I knew all along, Judy," or "Of course I did," or...
I think I did.
Were you concerned about that at all?
I wasn't. You see, for some reason, and I've never been physically afraid in a situation like that. You remember the one time when we got chased away and Jamie got so frightened? I wasn't afraid at that time.
I wasn't either.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know we were supposed to leave until he told us. I'm still not sure we were supposed to leave.
And, oh yes, that guy wanted us out of there. We were in the middle of recording, and he decided that we were bad news.
The children decided
the children were there, and they were threatening. And of course, Jamie, as a young man, would have been the first target. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And he had the camera.
And he'd grown up in the South, and he knew what those guys could do.
Can I ask you both to think about? So we've got to the point where you talk about how you got some of these interviews via courting the community, as you put it, George.
Okay.
So how was that scenario repeated or not repeated when you were doing further research?
Okay, now we came back to New York, and I was talking with Joan Dim, who was the press officer for Tisch School of the Arts. Mm-hmm. And I told her, she asked me what we were doing. She said, maybe I can get a story about what you're doing. And she finally did in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I told her the trouble we were having, getting people to talk. And she said, maybe I could help you. I lived in Charlotte for 10 years. My husband was it managing editor or city editor of the Charlotte Observer. I worked on the paper. I know those people. They have done good things before. She may have mentioned the fact that they won a Pulitzer Prize for putting out a huge whole section of the paper at one time about brown lung, which was very important at that time in getting the brown lung legislation. And that was right against the textile industry, so it was a courageous thing to do, just a few years before that. And she said, I think if I can go south with you, the Charlotte Observer may be willing to help you. So, and we went down, she put us up in the house of a friend, we lived there. We met the editor, the publisher, and the city editor. And the city editor thought it would be an interesting thing, and he asked if he could send a reporter out with us while we were doing an interview.
And you would be doing an interview where?
In the community, in the Gastonia community.
Okay.
Who was it we were interviewing when they took those pictures?
They didn't, and we decided not to do that. They came to us and we showed them archival footage.
But they took pictures of us while we were interviewing, didn't they?
No. They only took pictures of us.
I believe in that story. Do we have that story in the paper?
Yeah, we have that story. But it only shows a picture of me and you and the TV set.
But isn't there a description of an interview we did?
It's a description of an interview that we did that they're looking. I think it's a description in the interview.
I thought she went out with us. Anyway, with that you can look at that story.
Maybe she did.
I think so. But the headline said something about amnesia.
Uh-huh.
And we had... When did we decide to get the 800 number? Before that, had the 800?
We had the 1-800 number before that
We
because
did,
we
yeah.
never used it in the way
Yeah,
that we
that's
used
right.
it that day, though. Those
But
days.
what they did was to put the talk about amnesia, and then have a box, and you'll find it in the file, which says that if you have information about this, call this 800 number.
Now,
So by this time, let me just
Yeah.
set it up a teeny bit. By this time, you are using letters. You are using personal contacts that have been suggested by somebody who's been suggested by somebody. So at this point, that kind of groundwork is standard format for both of you at this point.
Yeah.
And now, in this case, you've gone to the media.
wait a second. So what year did we go down with Judith?
I'll find out. By the way, one of the people who helped us early on to find people was Janet Irons, because in doing her thesis, she had worked with Eula McGill, she had worked with Lucille Thornburg.
Didn't.
She didn't work
No,
with?
didn't interview her.
I'll be damned. I'm sorry. I didn't know that. She certainly worked with Eula McGill a lot.
Yeah, she did a lot of stuff in Alabama, and she had worked with those letters too. But and in some cases, she used those letters in a similar fashion to we did. But I think we wound up using those documents in a rather more rigorous way to find people because we had to, because we couldn't rely on text again.
And she warned us at the time. This was before she went out actually with us. She warned us at the time that we were going to have trouble finding these people and being willing to people being willing to talk.
Interesting enough, again, it took us a while to really come to terms, and I don't think until Suzanne Rostock was really working with us that it was really clear we are not going to have scholars as interlocutors in this movie. And there was always that feeling, well, okay, we can't get them to describe the big picture. We can only get them to describe this tiny, tiny little piece. And so often George would say, it's okay because we're going to get the scholars to give us the interstitial stuff. They'll give us the analysis. They'll give us the breadth and the width. And on one level, it was a problem because we often would rest on the idea that we didn't have to ask these people some really hard questions because the scholars would do it. And I think that if we had made that decision earlier on, we might have pushed the ticket with a lot of these people and maybe gone back for a second or a third interview and said, okay, you really got to help us figure this out. And by that point, we had gotten a little better at laying out, well, okay, if this person's having trouble with memory, that's okay, because we could lay out.
When did I start using the word linthead?
When did you start using the word linthead?
Because remember, I started finding fairly early on that got triggered people.
I'm sure you started doing that the first summer.
Can I just ask you a quick question, though? When was the decision made? So I'm just trying to get
It
the
wasn't
process
until ultimately made
to get this to decide that you're not going to.
Well, you see, we kept on pushing. We kept on saying, "Well, we'll do them later."
Not until long into the editing.
We'll do them later. We'll
Yeah.
do them later. So, unfortunately,
Right.
it was in the back of our minds a bit of something that we could. There was a little bit of assurance.
It's going to be Janet Irons, one thing, and Janet Irons went on location with us and did some of the interviewing.
But you know what? She did interviewing, but then we never sat and interviewed her.
No, we didn't.
Remember?
That's true, yeah.
We kept on putting it. Jackie Hall would probably be one, and all the scholars were sort of vying. Well, who's going to be your scholar? I mean,
and I remember saying that Janet Irons is ideal compared with Jackie Hall. Well, Jackie Hall's too pretty, and she and her manner and her looks are going to be a
distraction.
Too much of a contrast.
A contrast with the textile workers, but Janet Irons looks more like this and sounds more like that.
Now, what does that mean, George? You have to go to the bathroom.
Then I did. the July 14th, July 15th. Yeah, and that's when we went and let's see, is that when we, yeah, Clara Smith, that's when we did Andy Rossiter. That's where we did the stuff in the Union Hall.
None of it's in anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And we went back on the 25th.
I stayed in Columbus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's when I started staying down south for long stretches of time. Where were we?
We left off in terms of.
Was that Gastonia? No.
It was the Gaston. It was the Gaston Observer. It was the Gaston section of the Charlotte
Observer. The interesting thing was that this story was to appear in the Gaston edition of the Charlotte Observer. The Charlotte Observer has a whole bunch of regional editions. The city editor said that as he was making that up, he had a visit from some Junior Chamber of Commerce young man, and he was showing them how he made selections for the paper. And he pointed out, well, this is obviously a local story because it's about a strike, a textile strike, and assuming that it was the Gastonia 1929 strike, and we're putting it here. And the young man said, but that's the first story we would read. And they were from the whole region. That's the first story we would read. And so he decided to put a modified, a shorter story of that in all of the Charlotte Observer editions.
Oh, I forgot about that.
So that when our 800 number started answering, we got calls from people who were not in just the Gastonia area because of that.
But people had called their relatives in Florida. People had sent this little article to other people across the state. Somewhere in our archive, we recorded some of these phone calls on tape. Mm-hmm. But they were, I mean, and a lot of them I just transcribed by hand. Mm-hmm. They were extraordinary. I mean, we got a level of information and intrigue and this feeling of I need to tell this story in a way that we had not encountered at all.
Yeah. Some example.
But why do you think that was? Is that just a community base or different from community to community?
Well, I think, first of all, there was a level of anonymity, A. It was a 1-800 number. B, they had to come to us. We didn't exactly come to them. Right. It got the validity of the newspaper and the stempel,
no
the
doubt.
imprimatur.
I illustrate that. Somebody from Florida called us up and said, you should talk with, what's the guy's name in...
Ernest Moore.
No. The fellow, he's in the film, talking about the parade. We shall not be moved. What's his name?
Helton.
He was secretary of the local.
Uh-huh.
But his friend in Florida said you should call him up. I'm not leaving my name, but you could call him up. We called him up. He said, yes, he was secretary of the local. And he agreed to talk with us. And he took us around the Mill Village, but he was kind of mild and not very colorful.
Now, let me add one other thing. We knew who all these people were. We kept a list. We had like 50 people that had called us up. So I went back to the archives prior to our trip that summer, and I made sure that I got materials from every single one of these places that these folks were from.
That's Junie's archival experience, you see. It's very important here.
Because it was clear that these folks had to relate to something. I mean, they had to see their name in something
Yeah.
that we really needed to be able to say, but what about this specific event?
Yeah.
Because we were really dealing with generalities to a great extent.
So we went to this guy. Again, is his name?
His last name is Helton, and he was from I think the Groves Mill
Yeah. Okay.
in Gastonia, because that's where we had that list of all the that letter of protest that had all the petition
Yeah.
that had all those people's names.
Anyway, we went to him, and he took us around to the mill. He was very willing to talk and so on, but he just he said that he was secretary of the local, that he didn't really want to be there, but he got put there because he could write or type or something, and he was blacklisted for about 8 months, and then he got back in the mill, and he worked in the mill for the rest of his life. He had this nice house that he built, and then he said, well, you ought to talk to Ernest Moore, because Ernest's father was head of the local.
President
Of the local. So he took us over to Ernest's house. Now, I've told this story before, so it's a little smooth. But we knocked on the door, and Ernest came to the door. Remember, we were with his friend.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I was going to call you folks when I saw that article in the Charlotte Observer. We showed him, we had the article. But my son says you ought to do it because it's history, and my wife said if you do it, I'm going to get mad or I'm going to leave you something. My wife said you should
and my
do it.
sister said, "Don't do it."
Yeah. And we heard the wife from behind Ernest saying, "Well, if you want to talk to those people, you got to talk out of that house. I'm not having them in this house." So we actually did the first interview with Ernest Moore outside in his backyard.
And I think we decided to sort of rush and do it because
No,
we were so
no.
scared we would lose him, right?
And then she came out as we were leaving, inviting us to have Coca-Colas, being a nice Southern woman. And as we were drinking Coca-Colas, we said to them that we had this footage of the Labor Day parade, and would they like to see it? Well, they didn't have a VCR, but
The Heltons did.
The Heltons did. So we said, okay, would you come over the next day and see it? Of course, Ernest Moore said, I bet my daddy's in that parade. And she said, well, my father's somewhere in the parade, too.
The wife said this.
That's right. So the next day they came over, and they saw the parade, and Ernest thinks he found his father in the parade. And he started testifying. And then she started testifying about knowing about the strike and so forth. 2 days later, she and he came down with a trip that we took into the big Luray Mill,
Firestone
Mill, where the son, grandson of the fella who was the head of the 100 Mean Men, who represented the manufacturers in fighting the union.
in 29 or 34.
29. He didn't know anything about 34 practically, but in the 29 strike, and he was still head of security. But the factory had been taken over by
Japanese.
Not the Japanese. Yeah, the Japanese, but they had an East Indian manager, and he let us in and said it was okay. So this grandson, who was very proud of what his grandfather did, took us around, and that's where we got all those footage of the empty. They wouldn't let us go into the operating part of the mill. They just took it to the place where it was abandoned.
Right.
And we have on tape a fascinating description where Ernest is describing what he remembers about the 34 strike.
The 29 strike?
No,
with him, if he's talking to him, or the 34 strike?
I think it was and anyway, there's a very interesting discussion in which his wife is also a part. So they were willing to go down there and be identified and so forth and so on. But that was a big turn.
The amazing thing that happened too that day with Ernest, when we were just interviewing him alone, we showed him a little bit of the honey path footage, and he said, "Oh yeah, we went down there." Ouch! And we were amazed because this is the first time that we had any true documentation that these locals were interconnected with each other. And it was something that we were struggling to have someone be able to say, well, sure, here's a list of locals, and we would have a regional meeting, and this is how we knew each other. And the very fact, and 10,000 people did come down to that funeral, but we really hadn't been able to find. I'm sure if we put an ad in the paper, said if you went to the Honeypad funeral, here's our 1-800 number, call us. But I think that model of the 1-800 number was a really good one, and I have a feeling that that's something that we could have done a lot more of.
That's true.
I really do think so. But Ernest was, he said, my daddy and our 5 of us went down to that funeral, and it really did show a level of solidarity and interconnectedness that we were hard won to be able to document and show that had really occurred. And we knew that this strike wasn't just the spontaneous rebellion, that it was based on levels of organizing and connectedness and discussion and communication.
And we've got, in one of the samplers, by the way, we've got Ernest Moore responding to the Albert
Hinson.
Albert Hinson's speech to the strikers.
What does he say?
He says, yeah, that's Albert. He was all for the Union. And we got his story about what happened to his father who's head of the local, president of the local.
Currently? No, I'm sorry.
Ben.
Dead.
Had to leave town. Had to go back to the Appalachians where he came from. He couldn't get a job anymore.
Huh.
And Ernest was blacklisted for quite a long time.
So that article was really key because it did something for us, I think. It helped us realize that we don't need to be afraid of being public with what we were doing. That in fact, if we showed the courage to be public and to be public via institutions that are generally via institutions that are generally noted for being union or being anti-union.
Sorry, I can't cut it off. No.
Let's see how bad it sounds.
No.
No, it doesn't sound so bad. So, for instance, the Charlotte Observer was the paper that carried. Okay. The Charlotte Observer was the paper that carried this story, and it gave us some legitimacy. We met with the mayor of We met with the mayor of Gastonia during that trip, and I think that was recorded in this newspaper that we had met with him. And so we really learned early on that you really need to you need to trust that there are people in different institutions who are going to recognize, who might not have the same old attitude and approach to say, well, that's bad. You're making a film about unions, so you shouldn't do it. And by virtue of that, we led by power of example. If we made it okay and we made it public and we were even somewhat naive about it, then other people might say, well, you know what? Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time for me to talk. And I think that was a very important, that was a real milestone for us.
But just showing them their names on documents, or showing their relatives' names on documents, meant so much to these people. Now, maybe this is my reading into it.
I think you're right.
I think it meant, gee, we're somebody. Gee, my daddy was important. Gee.
But it also means, and it's also, again though, it's about busting people's notions about how institutions function, because they don't, I mean somebody, because the National Archive in Washington, D.C. thought enough of this document to say that this is important, we're going to keep it. So I don't think anyone, the way that they interpret it often is an archive in Washington, D.C. has kept all these letters that textile workers from North Carolina wrote in 1933, and that you bothered to go all the way from Washington back to New York to here to show me this letter. So, again, it busts institutions because they don't think that people are interested or they care or that they're really of value.
I think that having like a family around helped too.
Oh, huge.
It was a book.
Yeah.
And a respectable book from a Southern university
Right.
that most people didn't read, but it's just to have it there. It was
But
great.
a lot of people did read it. So that was institution busting too.
I'm sure it helped with Rosemary King Murphy.
Can you, I don't know if I'm jumping, but can you talk a bit about, let me know if this is the right place, about actually having some footage now and then showing that footage to people? Is that too much of a leap? Or is this...
When did we just show anything other than the archives? The first thing was at the
summer school in Dahlonega, Georgia.
was that before? That was after the old acquaintance reunion. Dahlonega was 91, wasn't it?
But the better question would be, then what happens after Gastonia? And you've got the 1-800 number. Now you realize that by utilizing certain institutions that you thought originally people might balk at, it actually lends an air of it's okay, maybe. What's the next step from there?
Well, then we connect. And George, I think was it 92 when that article came out, or was it 91?
What's that?
The article in.
I think it was 92, I believe. We've got the article.
Yeah. I think it was 92.
Yeah.
So, which meant that we actually, if that was the case, then I did the first. No, I think that article came out before we did the History as an Organizing Tool workshop, and that workshop took place in December of 91. I'm almost positive. I could be wrong. It certainly wasn't December of 92.
Oh, by the way, I've got the date where we met the Rainwater Sisters and then did the interview with Etta Mae Zimmerman. And it wasn't until August of 1990. August the 17th.
And when did we interview Opal McMichael? Was that...
we interviewed her twice, remember?
Uh-huh.
Let's see. Etta Mae Zimmerman, by the way.
In August?
Yeah.
And then we interviewed her a year later.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. We interviewed her the first... but the first time we talked with the Rainwater Sisters, we didn't interview them. We didn't them on camera.
And then the second time we went back, we did.
That's right. That was when the August the 17th.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we did interview Etta Mae Zimmerman the first time.
That we did. That's right.
And did we interview her the second time too?
Yes, we did. Remember,
that same summer?
Because she had palsy, and we didn't think we got it well enough.
And then we interviewed her after the old acquaintance reunion,
yes.
the year after.
Mm-hmm. Did I give you the old acquaintance reunion thing?
Was that...
interview with... we shot with Opal McMichaels on August the 20th. And then Factory, Rock Hill... we're talking about the first trip to Charlotte Observer. We went down with Joan Dim on the March the 14th We were there the 15th
What,
through
year, George? 92?
92 through the Thursday the 19th.
So, and you know what, George? If you look in your notes, is that when we met with people from the Catholic community?
Let me see. We stayed with Ray and Kim Jolly.
Right.
We had lunch with Ed Williams, editor and editorial page editor. We met with somebody named Powell, Rich Opal, editor of features. We met that evening at the Catholic Center.
That's where we met Barney Offerman for the first time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, and that's when we were showing our sample.
Bonnie Offerman, you're right.
Right.
I got his name
That's
down
when we
here.
met with.
Yeah.
That's when we met with the Catholics.
Yeah.
And because we were just in the process of trying to get that grant from the Catholic
Mm-hmm.
Communications Campaign. We had gone to grassroots leadership that December '91, and so things were really picking up for us.
In which way?
Well, in the way that we realized we had to make a film that first of all, that we had to make a film that was going to be useful to young people and to people, contemporary workers, and that they did not have to be children and descendants, and they did not have to be a direct bloodline between the elder textile workers and young contemporary workers, because they were all living out the legacy of the textile industry, of the 34 strike to greater and lesser extent. But all of them were confronting history and misconceptions and stereotypes and historical perceptions about unions and working people and organized labor on a daily basis as community organizers who were trying to address social and economic justice and equity and worker health and safety in North and South Carolina. And we were able that year to help to truly make the connection between the past and the present, and how the past and the interpretations of the past informed and impacted the present for young contemporary workers.
So when you are getting in touch with the Catholic Church and other, so is this when you say that this is when you started to shy away from the notion of, only the children of textile workers, this is when you thought about the more complex coalition?
Yes.
type
Oh
of-
yeah, and
Yeah.
and a lot of that came together at the grassroots leadership meeting that year, which was a pivotal meeting.
Is this the history as an organizer?
This is history as an organizing tool, and we had gone to meetings where we met with textile.
That's the name of a workshop that you held at the grassroots.
Right,
Okay.
right, and we had gone and done workshops. George, when did we do our first Delanago workshop?
I'm going to get to that. But by the way, this the reporter who wrote that story is named Ann Dow Helms,
Oh.
and she was the Gastonia reporter at the time.
And did she come with us somewhere? Does
Oh
it say?
yes, we did. Yeah, and their photographer was John D. Simmons.
Who did we interview with them?
I don't have it. No. But we talk about going to. I talk about going to Gastonia, meeting the mayor that day before, and then I left that evening, going back to New York, and then the next day doing letters of follow-up.
Like a crystal ball. I just met Daniel.
The story appeared. The story appeared in the Charlotte Observer on, I think it's Monday, the 23rd
March.
of March of 1992. That story you can check it, but I think that was what it was.
That story is a picture of me and George
Yeah.
and this TV set
And with the 800 number.
and the 800 number.
Now,
That was
what was the next thing you asked me to look up?
Wasn't a specific
oh, yeah,
thing,
it was-
more the Grassroots Leadership Conference.
no, I did ask him something specific.
Oh, sorry.
Excuse me. I was just wondering about Dahlonega.
Okay,
And-
now, that's Dahlonega. Is that? Let's see. That
The
should be
first time that we went there, it had to be 1990
1990.
or 91. It couldn't have been 92.
Well, let's see. This Judy with Clara Smith, Dinner with Clara and Children, Peanut Brown, singing Cabbagetown, Noonan, Georgia, the Library Review of Records, see Opal McMichael, Recall Strike. That's when the second recording with Opal McMichael's on the August the 1st. The Rainwater Sisters after that, Hogansville. This is August of 90. So it couldn't have been Dahlonega. Let's see. Oakland McMichael's again, Noonan, August the 16th. Parham's. Oakland McMichael's on August the 20th, where we got her cotton plant, remember? You weren't with us then.
That was.
No, you'd already gone back to New York, according to this. Jamie and I were there together. Rock Hill and
We started playing back our interviews
yeah,
That's what I
to
was hearing.
other
That's right.
people. And you know, interestingly enough, we were doing it with a very mixed group. We did it with seniors at senior centers to get them to respond, to tell their stories. We did it with social studies teachers. We did it with textile workers.
I'm sorry again, George or Judy, what year was that?
that was in June of 94.
No,
91.
So basically, we'd taken the material that we had collected in 90 and we had edited this very long sample tape. But we took a lot of the material from 90 and we're starting to already show it in 91 as a way to sort of show people, while other people are talking, you could talk too, as a way to elicit responses. On some level, as I don't think we realized it then, but as a way to figure out, are we doing anything that's effective?
Right.
Is this moving people or not moving people? So George, we played back footage of Opal McMichael telling her story
Yeah,
for those seniors
That's
in
right.
Noonan.
And what were some of the things that were coming to light when you were playing these things back? For example,
People were impressed that they could, convinced that they could tell their own story, that they wouldn't sound illiterate. They didn't put it that way. But they looked nice, and they.
Right, and also they were listening to other people like themselves who spoke like them talk on TV.
Right.
I mean, it was on TV, even
Right.
though we were pushing the cassette in and stuff.
and so this is kind of the beginning of the process of where you are, you're playing back stuff, you're getting responses, and you're deciding what gaps there are or what kind of approaches.
We knew that there were tons of gaps because we were no way nearly had enough people to make this movie at all. And we clearly had a couple of older witnesses. We had witnesses who were sort of possibly major players in the strike or went on to be trade unionists, but we didn't have sort of the rank and file. We didn't have a sense of sort of the regular people, the masses that had been a part of this, so which catapulted us forward. So I would say in 90, we started off by showing the archival footage, and the archival footage led us from town to town and made us make those decisions. And George, I guess we should talk about the inherent problem of using archival footage from a strike to make a movie about a strike, because the problem is, one of the things that we were most concerned about, and George, we sort of knew this. Yeah, we were. Our concern was we had this concern prior to our starting to do these workshops with younger workers. When someone says union, everyone immediately thinks strike.
But we had a traumatic meeting with Janet Irons. We spent 3 days at the Southern Regional Council looking at all the footage and talking about where the hell we were going. Remember?
Oh, yeah.
And when was that about?
That's in July the 11th, 12th, and 13th.
Of 91?
Of 91.
Okay.
And that's when we realized we just didn't have it.
Yeah. Now, at that point, you had not only used... So at 90, you're using archival footage. 91, you're already showing other people samples that you've already filmed.
Right,
People
and
giving
we were also,
interviews.
and we had this very long meeting with Janet Irons. Thank you, George. And Janet Irons and I left that meeting planning the first part of the workshop, History as an Organizing Tool. We created the first elements of that, because we went to Dahlonega, Georgia, to do a workshop for textile workers for 2 days. And we basically chose letters that we were going to show them, and we chose photographs that we were going to show them. We chose footage that we were going to show them. We chose archival footage and interview material. And the History as an Organizing Tool, it got refined for grassroots leadership. But this is the first time that we showed it to these sort of young textile workers and tried to start making the connection with them between the past and the present, between this strike and their experience. And it was actually, but we were still hung up on trying to find young textile workers who had parents and grandparents who'd been involved, or who lived in towns where there must have been a lot of involvement.
And so when did that conception change? This was
that conception changed. No, the conception changed about 6 months later.
Why?
When I took the same workshop, much more refined, to grassroots leadership, and found a much more compelling and sort of thoughtful audience in this very mixed group of textile workers and communication workers and people that are dealing with different kinds of industries and community organizations that didn't use a union model. And in a sense, those people were had a much more heightened awareness of what anti-unionism meant, because some of them couldn't even use a union model to do their organizing. And so they were confronting the myths and the stereotypes that were attributed to unions on a daily basis, or to your organization. And that's where we sort of did this. That's when we started using this butcher block pieces of paper, to get the word union.
When did you decide that we had to get more black?
That's what I was trying to kind of get at, because if I remember correctly, at one point both of you have discussed this, that you're viewing some of the footage that you filmed and you realize this is white, and it's not solely a white story, but what made you come to that?
Judy came back from showing it at union meetings and finding that...
I think the biggest problem, in a way, it could have been at the North Carolina... George, if I had diaries like you did, we'd be in business. I guess I felt somewhat uncomfortable at the grassroots leadership meeting, because to some extent, because there were not that many, because there wasn't enough black voices in the movie. I think that...
And I kept saying, look, it's not a black story. Almost none of them worked in the mills. They weren't allowed to work in the mills. There's not in the footage. And they said, but we were there somewhere.
Okay.
And so Judy started looking for it, and we went to, with Father Kloster's help, we went to the black church there, the black Catholic church, and got all that good stuff.
When did we do that?
That's what
I'm going to find out in a few minutes.
How did we find Father Kloster?
Well, could it be when? Well, you talked a while ago, not too long ago, about broaching the Catholic Church when you were getting
Yeah,
the
it
Catholic
could have been
funding.
that, and it could have been that I talked to him
By
about.
the Offermans in Gloucester.
Yeah,
work
they
together.
said you should talk to Gloucester, and then I didn't. It turned out that he was the son of a mill management person.
So about that same time is when you're realizing that there's a black story here that's not being told with what we've done so far.
Right, and also, I don't remember when I went to the first state federation meeting of the North Carolina state feds, but when I went there was a huge black audience too. The first time that I went there to show a rough cut, but
So wait a minute, by that time you already have a rough cut?
well, excerpts or.
Okay.
August the 20th, and around that when we were with the Kannapolis people and
What
the
year was
union.
that?
This was in 1991.
Okay.
Piedmont Peace Project. That's when we did some recording with the Piedmont Peace Project. So you'd had their relationship with the Piedmont
Right,
Peace
I had
Project.
met them before grassroots
Yeah, when did you meet
leadership,
them?
and that was really pivotal.
Yeah.
That was really pivotal.
Okay, now that gives you a key, so that by the time, by August of 1991, you were well into that. So it must have been earlier than that.
Well, I went to visit, since I was spending all this time in Kannapolis, I went to visit the Piedmont Peace Project, and in fact, George, didn't I go to Kannapolis? Didn't I go in 1990 to Kannapolis for the first time?
I don't think so, because they weren't organizing then.
I know they weren't organizing, but I think I was referred, but because we had footage of Concord, North Carolina, I decided that I wanted to go to Concord, North Carolina, and we knew one guy in Concord, Bob Friedman.
Oh, yes.
And then I must have told Cy Khan that I was going to be going, and he said, well, you should go visit the Piedmont Peace Project. So I went to PPP, and I said, look, I have this footage from your town. And I sat down with Linda Stout and Susan and Connie Leeper, I think, and George Friday, and I showed them this material. And I recorded the discussion with them, which I believe I still have, which is the first time it's like sort of, again, but these were children of textile workers because they were living in this textile town, and they were just floored. They said, I've lived here my whole life.